Sometimes doing the right thing costs you everything. Sometimes the person you save becomes the one who destroys you. Jonah Pike found a dying woman in a blizzard and carried her to safety. He kept her warm through the night, tended her fever, and asked nothing in return. When Clara Whitfield woke in his cabin, confused and afraid, she didn't see her rescuer. She saw a stranger. When the search party arrived, she pointed at Jonah and said two words that shattered his life. "He took me. Now he sits in chains, facing a rope," while she begins to remember what really happened that night. But will the truth come in time to save an innocent man? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Bitterroot Mountains had a way of keeping secrets. In the winter of 1883, those granite peaks held more snow than most men had seen in a lifetime, and among those frozen ridges lived a man who preferred it that way. Jonah Pike had made his home in these mountains for near on 15 years, and in all that time, he'd grown comfortable with silence. His cabin sat in a clearing halfway up the western slope, tucked against a stand of pine that broke the worst of the wind. It wasn't much to look at: rough-hewn logs chinked with moss and clay, a stone chimney that drew smoke clean, a single window facing east to catch the morning light. But it was solid. Jonah had built it with his own hands, every notch and beam, and it had weathered more storms than he cared to count. Inside, the cabin spoke of a man who lived deliberately. A narrow bed with a wool blanket tucked tight at the corners, a table and single chair positioned near the window. Shelves lined one wall, holding tins of coffee and flour, dried meat wrapped in cloth, and a collection of books that would have surprised most folks who thought mountain men couldn't read. A rifle rested above the door, cleaned and oiled. Traps hung from pegs, mended and ready. Everything had its place. On the table lay Jonah's journal, a leather-bound book worn soft with handling. The pages held sketches of elk and eagles, notes about weather patterns and animal movements, and scattered throughout, observations about life that came to a man when he spent most of his days alone. He wrote in a careful hand, the kind taught by a mother who'd valued education even on the frontier. Jonah himself was 45, though the mountains had weathered him in ways that made exact age hard to pin. His face was lean, tanned dark by sun and wind, with lines etched deep around eyes that were still sharp. His hair, more grey than brown now, hung past his collar. He kept his beard trimmed close, a vanity from another life. His hands were scarred from years of work. Rope burns, knife slips, frostbite that had taken the tip of his left pinky one brutal January. He moved with the economy of a man who'd learned that wasted motion meant wasted warmth. When he walked his trapline, he stepped sure and quiet. When he worked, splitting wood or skinning pelts, his movements were practiced and efficient. There was a stillness about him, the kind that came from making peace with solitude. But Jonah Pike hadn't always been a hermit. Once he'd been a husband. Once he'd been a father. Sarah had been a schoolteacher's daughter, with honey-colored hair and a laugh that could warm a room. They'd met in Denver, married in spring, and headed west with dreams of starting fresh. Little Emma had come the following year, a tiny thing with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn chin. They'd tried farming first, but Jonah's skills lay elsewhere. He'd worked as a scout, guiding wagon trains through mountain passes, using his gift for reading terrain and weather. It had been good work, honest work, and it paid enough to keep his family fed. Sarah had been patient with his long absences, and Emma had run to him like he was the sun itself every time he came home. Then the fever came. It swept through their settlement one autumn, and it took them both within a week of each other. Sarah first, then Emma 3 days later. Jonah had buried them on a hillside overlooking a valley they'd loved, and something in him had been buried with them. He'd sold everything, taken his grief into the mountains, and never looked back. That was 15 years ago. In all that time, he'd built a life that didn't require other people. He trapped beaver and marten, tanned the pelts himself, and twice a year he'd make the long trek down to the trading post at Ashford Creek to sell his furs and buy supplies. He spoke only when necessary, and most folks had learned not to press him for conversation. Old Samuel, who ran the trading post, was one of the few who understood. Samuel had lost people too, and he recognized that particular kind of quiet in Jonah. They'd developed a friendship built on mutual respect and very few words. Samuel always gave Jonah fair prices, and Jonah always paid his debts. The town itself, Ashford Creek, had grown up around the trading post and a silver mine that had played out 5 years back. About 300 souls lived there now, farming and ranching in the valley, trying to make something permanent in a hard land. Jonah knew them by sight, but not by name, and that suited everyone just fine. They thought of him as a curiosity, mostly, the mountain man who came down twice a year, traded his furs, and disappeared again. Some of the older women clucked their tongues, saying it wasn't natural for a man to live alone like that. Some of the young men romanticized it, imagining themselves doing the same until they really thought about the cold and the loneliness. But most people just accepted that Jonah Pike was part of the landscape, like the mountains themselves. If they'd known him before, they might have seen the man he'd been. They might have recognized the intelligence in those quiet eyes, the education in his careful speech. On the rare occasions he spoke more than 3 words together. They might have understood that he'd chosen this life, not because he couldn't manage among people, but because he no longer wanted to risk loving anyone enough to lose them. But they didn't know him before, and Jonah preferred it that way. On this particular November morning, Jonah stood outside his cabin with his face turned to the northern sky. The air had that peculiar stillness that preceded a big storm, and the light had gone flat and grey. He'd been watching the weather for 3 days now, noting the dropping pressure, the way the birds had gone quiet, how his knee, broken years ago and never quite right since, had started aching something fierce. A blizzard was coming. Not just a snow squall, but one of those storms that could bury a man who wasn't prepared. Jonah spent the day making ready. He brought in extra firewood, stacking it against the interior wall where it would stay dry. He checked his stores, making sure he had enough to last a week or more if the storm trapped him inside. He brought water from the creek, filling every container he had, knowing the creek might freeze solid. He secured the shutters and reinforced the door, packing snow against the base to keep the wind from whistling through. By late afternoon, the first flakes were falling. By evening, the wind had picked up, driving the snow horizontal. Jonah lit his lamp and settled at his table with his journal, documenting the storm's arrival. He sketched the way the pines bent under the wind's assault, made notes about temperature and wind direction. Outside, the world was disappearing into white. Jonah added wood to the fire and made himself a simple dinner, beans and salt pork, coffee strong enough to strip paint. He ate slowly, watching the storm through the cracks in the shutters. This was going to be a bad one. He could feel it in his bones. He thought briefly about the town below, hoping folks there had the sense to stay inside. Traveling in this weather was suicide. Anyone caught out in it wouldn't last an hour. As he cleaned his plate and banked the fire for the night, Jonah had no way of knowing that tomorrow his entire life would change. That his choice to live alone and apart from the world was about to collide with someone else's desperate flight into the storm. That his 15 years of carefully constructed solitude were about to shatter like ice on a warming river. All he knew was that the storm was here. And it was going to be a long night. He settled into his bunk, pulled the wool blanket up, and listened to the wind howl like something alive and angry, battering itself against his cabin walls. Tomorrow he'd check his trapline if the storm broke. Tomorrow he'd make sure the cabin had weathered it intact. Tomorrow would take care of itself, the way it always did. Outside, the snow kept falling, and somewhere down the mountain, a woman was making a decision that would destroy them both. Dawn came late and grey, the world outside muffled under 2 feet of fresh snow. Jonah woke to silence. The kind that comes after a storm has blown itself out, leaving everything still and frozen. He dressed quickly in the cold cabin, his breath clouding in front of his face as he stirred the embers in the fireplace and added kindling. The coffee took longer than usual to heat, the cold having seeped into everything overnight. While he waited, Jonah pulled on his heavy coat, the one lined with beaver fur, and wrapped a wool scarf around his neck. His boots were by the door where he'd left them, and he stamped into them, feeling the stiffness of leather that had gotten too cold. Outside, the world had been transformed. Snow lay thick on every surface, weighing down the pine branches until they drooped low. The sky was still overcast, threatening more snow, but for now the air was calm. Jonah's breath hung in front of him, and the cold bit at his exposed skin. He had work to do. His trapline ran along the creek for about 3 miles, a circuit he'd walked so many times he could manage it in his sleep. The storm would have complicated things. Traps buried under snow, frozen mechanisms, maybe some catches he'd need to deal with. He strapped on his snowshoes, slung his pack over his shoulder, and set out. The going was slow. Even with snowshoes, he sank 6 inches with each step, and the effort warmed him quickly despite the cold. He checked the first 3 traps and found nothing. The 4th had been sprung by a branch that had fallen under the weight of snow. He reset it and moved on. It was at the bend in the creek, where the water pooled before dropping down a series of rocky steps, that he saw something that made him stop, a splash of color against the white. Blue fabric, half buried in a snowdrift near the water's edge. Jonah approached carefully, his mind already working through possibilities. A piece of cloth blown in by the wind. Something washed downstream before the freeze. But as he got closer, his heart began to beat faster. It wasn't just fabric. It was a cloak, and there was a person inside it. He dropped to his knees beside the drift, his hands already moving to brush away snow. A woman lay curled on her side, her dark hair frozen stiff, her skin a terrible shade of blue-white. She wasn't moving. Jonah pressed his fingers to her neck, searching for a pulse. For a long moment he felt nothing, and he thought he was too late. Then faint, so faint he almost missed it, a flutter beneath his fingertips. She was alive. Barely. His mind raced through options. She needed warmth, needed it now, or she'd be dead within the hour. The cabin was a mile back. Could she survive being moved? Could she survive if he left her to get help? There was no real choice. Leaving her meant death. Moving her might kill her too, but at least there was a chance. Jonah worked quickly, his movements efficient despite the urgency clawing at him. He pulled off his own coat and wrapped it around her, then carefully worked his arms beneath her body. She was small, maybe 25 or so, dressed in clothes too fine for mountain travel, a torn dress beneath the cloak, thin boots that were soaked through. When he lifted her, her head lolled against his chest. She weighed almost nothing, and he could feel how cold she was even through his shirt. He settled her weight against him and began the trek back to his cabin, moving as fast as he dared on the snowshoes. The journey that had taken him 30 minutes outbound took nearly an hour coming back. By the time he reached his cabin, his arms were shaking with effort and his lungs burned from the cold air. He kicked the door open and carried her inside, kicking it shut behind him. The fire had burned down to coals. Jonah laid her on his bunk and immediately set to work building the fire back up, feeding it until flames leapt high and heat began to fill the small space. Then he turned his attention to the woman. Her wet clothes had to come off. They were stealing what little warmth she had left. Jonah worked with clinical efficiency, his face set in concentration. He'd seen hypothermia before, knew the protocols. Modesty meant nothing when someone was dying. He removed her boots first, wincing at how frozen her feet were. Her stockings came next, then the soaked dress and undergarments. He kept his eyes on his work, focusing on the task at hand. Her skin was mottled with cold, and there were bruises. On her arms, her shoulder, a nasty one darkening along her ribs. She'd taken a fall, probably several. He wrapped her in every blanket he owned, then added his spare clothes for extra layers. Built up the fire even higher. Heated water and used cloths to warm her hands and feet gradually. Too fast and he'd damage the tissue. He checked her breathing, counted her pulse, watched for signs of frostbite. Hours passed. Jonah kept vigil, adding wood to the fire, checking her vital signs, trying to get her body temperature up. As the cabin grew warmer, He removed his own wet outer layers and hung them to dry, working in his shirt sleeves. The woman began to show signs of improvement as afternoon faded toward evening. Her skin lost some of that deathly blue tinge. Her breathing grew less shallow. But she didn't wake, and Jonah started to worry about other injuries he couldn't see. As darkness fell, he lit his lamp and made himself coffee, though he didn't dare leave her side for long. He kept checking her pulse, her breathing, the color of her skin. He talked to her sometimes, though he didn't know if she could hear him. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "Just need to rest. Let your body warm up." Around midnight she began to stir, small movements at first, her fingers twitching, her head turning. Then her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. Jonah moved closer, keeping his voice calm. "Easy now. You're all right. You were caught in the storm." She stared at him without comprehension, her eyes fever bright. Then her gaze moved past him, taking in the unfamiliar cabin, the rough walls, the single room. When her eyes came back to him, something changed in them. Fear. "Where?" Her voice was a rasp, barely audible. "Where am I?" "My cabin. Up in the mountains. I found you by the creek, half frozen. You'd have died if I hadn't brought you back." She tried to sit up, then gasped in pain, her hand going to her ribs. Jonah reached out to steady her, and she flinched away from him. "Don't touch me." He pulled his hand back, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. "You're hurt. Took a fall, looks like. Maybe a cracked rib. You need to stay still." "My clothes." Her eyes went wide as she realized she was dressed in unfamiliar garments, wrapped in blankets. "What did you—" "They were soaked through. You'd have died from the cold. I had to get you warm." She was shaking now, and not just from cold. Her eyes darted around the cabin, looking for exits, for weapons, for anything. When she looked back at him, her face had gone pale. "I need to leave. I need to go home." "Can't. Storm's passed, but there's 2 feet of snow out there, and you can barely sit up. You need rest, need to recover. In a day or 2, no." The word came out sharp, panicked. "No, I can't stay here. People will be looking for me. They'll think—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Jonah understood what she wasn't saying. A young woman alone with a strange man, miles from town. It looked bad, and they both knew it. "I'll take you down as soon as you're strong enough," he said. "I give you my word. But right now you can't walk, and I can't carry you that far in deep snow. We'd both die trying." She stared at him, her breath coming fast and shallow. Then her eyes rolled back, and she slumped against the pillows, unconscious again. Jonah sat back, running a hand over his face. This was bad. He'd done the right thing, the only thing he could do, but already he could see how it would look to others. A well-dressed young woman from town, found alone in his cabin. He should have left her there. Should have walked away and let the cold take her, if only to protect himself, but he hadn't, because that wasn't who he was. He'd saved her life, and now he'd have to live with whatever came next. Outside, the wind was picking up again, and fresh snow began to fall. Jonah added wood to the fire and settled into his chair, watching over his unexpected guest. Neither of them knew that down in the valley, a search party was already forming. That by morning men would be riding up into the mountains, looking for Clara Whitfield. That when they found her in Jonah Pike's cabin, everything he'd done to save her would be twisted into something dark. The long night stretched ahead, and Jonah kept his vigil, tending the fire and watching the woman sleep. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. For now, all he could do was make sure she survived until morning. The snow kept falling, covering their tracks, burying the truth under layers of white. The Whitfield house sat on the hill overlooking Ashford Creek, a 2-story frame structure painted white with green shutters, the finest home in town. Clara had grown up in these rooms, walked these halls, looked out these windows at the valley below. She'd always thought of it as a refuge. Now, it felt like a prison. Her mother, Elizabeth Whitfield, had taken over completely from the moment the carriage arrived. Clara had been swept upstairs, bathed, examined by Dr. Morrison, and tucked into her own bed like a child. Her sisters, Margaret and Susan, had hovered nearby, their faces full of concern and curiosity. The doctor had pronounced her fortunate. Bruised ribs. Mild frostbite on her toes, some contusions and scrapes, but nothing permanently damaged. He'd recommended rest, warm drinks, and time. Then he'd exchanged a meaningful look with her mother before leaving. That look had said everything. A young woman alone all night with a strange man. There would be whispers. There would be questions. There would be damage to her reputation that no amount of explaining could fully repair. Now, as afternoon light slanted through her bedroom window, Clara lay still and tried to remember. The memories were there, but they were fragmented, like a shattered mirror. She could see pieces, but couldn't quite make them form a whole picture. She remembered being angry, furious actually. She remembered Richard's face, his voice raised. What had they been arguing about? She closed her eyes and tried to focus. They'd been in his study. He'd been drinking, which wasn't unusual, but there had been something different about his mood that day. Something cold and calculating. The wedding needs to happen soon, he'd said. Your father agrees. We've already waited long enough. She'd felt something twist in her stomach. I asked for more time. I'm not ready. You're 24 years old, Clara. How much more ready do you need to be? There had been more, she was sure of it, but the memory slipped away like water through her fingers. She'd left his house angry, had saddled her horse over the stable boy's protests about the weather, and ridden out toward... Where? Where had she been going? A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, she called, expecting her mother. Instead, Richard entered carrying a bouquet of hothouse roses. He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. How's my brave girl? Clara pulled the blanket a little higher. Tired, confused. That's to be expected. Dr. Morrison said the cold and the trauma could affect your memory. He set the flowers on her bedside table and sat in the chair her mother had occupied earlier. You gave us all quite a scare. Richard, I need to ask you something. Clara watched his face carefully. What were we arguing about? Before I left. Something flickered across his expression, too quick to identify. Arguing. Darling, we weren't arguing. You were having pre-wedding jitters, that's all. Feeling overwhelmed by the planning. I suggested you rest, but you wanted to ride instead. I should have stopped you. That wasn't right. Clara was certain it wasn't right. But her head ached, and the memories wouldn't come into focus. The man who found me, she said. Jonah Pike. He said I would have died if he hadn't. He took advantage of a terrible situation. Richard's voice hardened. God knows what he did to you while you were helpless. You can't remember, Clara. That should tell you everything. But I don't remember him hurting me either. I don't remember anything bad because you were unconscious, delirious. The doctor said you had a fever. Richard leaned forward, taking her hand. His grip was firm, almost too firm. That man is dangerous, Clara. He lives like an animal up in those mountains, away from decent society. When he saw an opportunity, he could have left me there, or he could have ridden for help. Instead, he took you to his cabin, isolated, where no one could hear you scream. Richard's thumb rubbed across her knuckles, and the gesture that should have been comforting felt wrong somehow. I'm just grateful we found you in time. Before anything worse happened. Clara pulled her hand away. I'm very tired. Richard stood, his expression difficult to read. Of course. You need rest. I'll come back tomorrow. He moved to the door, then paused. Clara, the wedding. I know this has been traumatic, but I think we should move forward as planned. Maybe even sooner. You need stability, protection. You need someone to take care of you. After he left, Clara lay staring at the ceiling. Something was wrong. Something about his words, his manner, the way he'd gripped her hand. But she couldn't identify what it was, and the harder she tried to remember, the more the memories seemed to slip away. Margaret slipped in an hour later, closing the door quietly behind her. At 22, she was the middle sister, sharp-eyed and perceptive in ways that had always made Clara both grateful and uncomfortable. How are you, really? Margaret asked, settling on the edge of the bed. I don't know. I can't remember what happened. Not clearly. Do you remember arguing with Richard? Clara looked at her sister sharply. He says we weren't arguing. That I was just anxious about the wedding. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Clara, I need to tell you something. I didn't like him before, and I like him even less now. What do you mean? The way he's acting, it's wrong. You nearly died, and all he can talk about is moving the wedding forward. Margaret's voice dropped lower. And something else. When the search party came back yesterday, when they brought you in, Richard arrived before them. Clara frowned. What? He was already in town when they found you. The search party sent a rider ahead to announce they'd found you, and Richard was in the street waiting. But he left to search at the same time as everyone else, and his horse was exhausted. He should have still been out looking. Maybe he came back to wait. Or went a different direction. Clara, Margaret gripped her hand. He came back hours before they found you. I saw him myself, talking to Father. He knew you were missing, but he wasn't out searching for you. The words hung in the air between them. Clara felt something cold settle in her stomach. Why wouldn't he search for me? I don't know. But I think you need to remember what you were arguing about. I think you need to remember what really happened before that storm. After Margaret left, Clara lay in the gathering darkness and tried again to remember. The pieces were there, Richard's face angry, his hand on her arm gripping too tight, her fear sharp and sudden, the decision to leave, to ride away, to what? Where had she been going? And why had Richard let her go into a storm instead of stopping her? The questions circled in her mind as night fell and the house grew quiet around her. Somewhere across town, Jonah Pike sat in a cell, accused of crimes he might not have committed, and somewhere in Clara's fractured memories lay the truth that could save or damn them both. The trading post sat at the edge of town, a weathered building that smelled of leather and coffee and the sweet tang of tobacco. Old Samuel had run it for 30 years, and in that time he'd seen most of the town's secrets pass through his door. Clara entered with Margaret just after dawn, when the streets were still quiet. Samuel looked up from sorting pelts, his weathered face creasing into surprise. Miss Whitfield. Didn't expect to see you here. Mr. Samuel, I need your help. Clara glanced back at the empty street. It's about Jonah Pike. Samuel's expression sharpened. Come into the back. His office was small and cluttered, stacked with ledgers and samples of fur. He gestured for them to sit, then closed the door. I'm listening. Clara told him everything, her recovered memories, Richard's threats, the debts she'd seen. Samuel listened without interrupting, his face growing more troubled with each word. I knew Jonah before, he said when she finished, before he went into the mountains. He was a good man then, and good men don't change their nature. He stood and moved to a cabinet, pulling out a leather-bound book. He left this with me. His journal. Asked me to hold it safe when he came down for supplies last fall. He handed it to Clara. She opened it carefully, seeing neat handwriting and detailed sketches, pages of observations about weather and wildlife, and scattered throughout philosophical musings that spoke of a thoughtful, educated mind. This proves his character, Clara said softly. Maybe, but character isn't proof of innocence in the eyes of the law. Samuel sat back down. You need something concrete. Something that proves Richard Thornton is the real villain here, his debt records. If I could get them, you'd be trespassing, breaking into his home. Samuel's eyes were serious. And if he's as dangerous as you say, you'd be putting yourself at terrible risk. I can't let an innocent man hang. Noble sentiment. But you need to be smart about it. Samuel thought for a moment. The bank? All loans that large would have records at the bank. Nathaniel Rogers is the manager. He's an honest man, owes me a favor. Let me talk to him, see if I can get a look at Thornton's accounts. Would he do that? Isn't it confidential? For most folks, yes. But when there's a question of fraud, when someone's life hangs in the balance, Samuel smiled slightly. Nathaniel has a conscience. Sometimes that matters more than rules. Over the next 2 days, Clara and Margaret became regular visitors to the trading post, ostensibly shopping for supplies, but really waiting for news. Clara also made a point of visiting the sheriff's office, speaking with Tom Brennan, carefully building a case that her memories were returning. I remember more each day, she told the sheriff on the 3rd visit. The argument with Richard. His anger. I was afraid of him, Sheriff. That's why I rode out in the storm. Sheriff Macklin listened, but she could see the skepticism in his eyes. Miss Whitfield, you understand how this looks. First you can't remember, then you remember he saved you. Now you're saying you were running from your fiancée. People will say you're just trying to what? Ruin my own reputation? Make myself look like a fool? Clara's voice was sharp. I'm telling you the truth. Jonah Pike is innocent, and Richard Thornton is dangerous. Then prove it, the sheriff said, not unkindly. Bring me something concrete, and I'll listen. But I can't dismiss charges against Pike based on memories that keep changing. That evening, Samuel sent word. He'd gotten the bank records. They met at the trading post after dark, Margaret standing watch at the door while Samuel spread papers across his desk. Nathaniel copied these himself, Samuel said. Took a risk doing it, but he's concerned about justice too. He pointed to a series of entries. Look here. Thornton borrowed $50,000 from your father 3 years ago, supposedly for mine expansion, but the mine closed 2 years ago, Clara said. Exactly. And look at these other debts. Gambling debts in Denver, payments to various creditors. He's been losing money for years, covering losses with new loans. Samuel's finger traced another line. And here's the interesting part. He took out a life insurance policy on you 6 months ago. Clara felt ice settle in her stomach. On me, $50,000 payable to your husband in the event of your death. But you weren't married yet, so he listed himself as beneficiary, as your intended spouse. Samuel looked up, his eyes grave. Clara, if you died in that storm, he'd have collected enough to pay off all his debts and still have money left over, Margaret gasped. He tried to kill her, or at least didn't try very hard to save her, Samuel said. A man who really loved his fiancée would have been out in that storm searching all night. Instead, witnesses saw him at the saloon drinking until the search party formed the next morning. Clara's hands were shaking. This proves it. This proves he let me ride into danger, maybe even encouraged it. It proves motive, Samuel corrected. But it doesn't prove he hurt you or that Jonah Pike didn't. For that, we need something else. What? Clara asked desperately. We need to catch him in a lie. Or better yet, catch him admitting the truth. Samuel looked at her seriously. Clara, I need you to think carefully. Can you face him? Can you talk to him? Maybe get him to reveal something he shouldn't? You want her to confront him? Margaret's voice rose. That's dangerous. It's the only way. Clara's voice was steady now, certain. I'll do it. I'll make him tell me the truth. Not alone, Samuel said firmly. We'll plan it carefully. The sheriff needs to be nearby, hidden. And we'll need witnesses, people who can testify to what they hear. They spent the next hour planning. Clara would invite Richard to her family's garden, a semi-public space where others could be nearby but hidden. She'd tell him she was ready to move forward with the wedding, that she wanted to clear the air about what had happened. And then she'd push him carefully to admit what he'd done. It was risky. If Richard suspected a trap, it could be dangerous. But it was the best chance they had. As Clara and Margaret prepared to leave, Samuel caught Clara's arm. Be careful. A desperate man is capable of anything, and Richard Thornton is very, very desperate. Clara nodded, but her resolve didn't waver. She thought of Jonah Pike sitting in that cell, calm and dignified, facing execution for a crime he didn't commit. She would save him, no matter the cost. The telegram arrived at Samuel's trading post on a Wednesday afternoon. 3 days before Jonah's trial was scheduled to begin. Samuel had been expecting something. He'd sent inquiries to Denver and San Francisco, asking contacts to investigate Richard Thornton's financial dealings and reputation. But what came back was more damning than he'd imagined. He read it twice, then sent his grandson running to fetch Clara. She arrived within the hour, breathless, Margaret at her side. Samuel handed her the telegram without preamble. Richard Thornton, stop multiple. Gambling debts, Denver, stop. Known associate of criminal elements. Stop engaged to wealthy widow, same time as your miss. Whitfield, stop. Widow died, suspicious fall last year, stop insurance. Paid stop investigation, inconclusive, stop advise, caution. Stop. Clara's hands began to shake as she read. He's done this before. Looks that way, Samuel said grimly. The widow's name was Catherine Brennan. Fell from a balcony at her home during a party. Ruled accidental, but there were questions. The party was at Thornton's suggestion. He was nearby when she fell, and he collected 20,000 from her life insurance as her intended husband. This is murder. Margaret's voice was barely a whisper. He's killed before, and he was trying to kill Clara. We need to take this to the sheriff, Clara said, already moving toward the door. But Samuel caught her arm. Wait. There's more. He produced a second document, a letter he'd received through more discreet channels. This came from a lawyer in Denver. Seems Catherine Brennan's family never believed it was an accident. They hired investigators, but couldn't prove anything. The lawyer's still working the case, looking for evidence. Clara scanned the letter, her mind racing. If we can connect what he did to Catherine with what he tried to do to me, it's still circumstantial, Samuel warned. But it establishes a pattern. A man who courts wealthy women, insures their lives and benefits when they die. That's not coincidence. We need to move up our plan, Clara said. Before he realizes we know. They'd planned to confront Richard in the Whitfield garden the following week. But now, with this evidence in hand, waiting seemed dangerous. Clara sent a message to Richard that evening, asking him to meet her the next morning. She wrote that she was ready to discuss reconciliation, that she wanted to put the terrible incident behind them and move forward with the wedding. Richard replied within the hour, his note effusive and relieved. Of course he'd meet her. He'd been waiting for her to come to her senses. That night, Clara barely slept. She kept thinking about Catherine Brennan, about a woman who'd trusted Richard and paid with her life. She thought about how close she'd come to the same fate, would have met it if not for Jonah Pike. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Clara dressed carefully, putting on the engagement ring Richard had given her. She needed him to believe she was sincere. Sheriff Macklin and Tom Brennan arrived early, positioning themselves behind the hedge that bordered the garden. Samuel was there too, hidden in the gazebo. Margaret stood at an upper window where she could see but not be seen. When Richard arrived, he looked almost boyish in his enthusiasm. He swept Clara into his arms, kissing her cheek. I knew you'd see reason, he said. This whole terrible business, Pike being arrested, your confusion about what happened, it's been so hard on you. But now we can move past it. I need to understand something first, Clara said, stepping back. That day before the storm, we argued about something. I still can't quite remember what. A shadow crossed Richard's face, but he recovered quickly. Wedding jitters, darling. You were overwhelmed by all the planning. No. Clara kept her voice gentle but firm. It was about money. I saw papers on your desk, debts. Richard's smile tightened. You were snooping through my private affairs. I was concerned about our future. Those debts were substantial, Richard. And the loan from my father. You said it was for the mine. But the mine's been closed for 2 years. Business complications. Nothing you need to worry about. $50,000 is something I need to worry about. Clara watched his face carefully. Especially when I'm about to marry the man who owes it. Richard's expression shifted, the charm sliding away to reveal something colder underneath. What are you getting at, Clara? I'm trying to understand why you let me ride into a storm. Why you didn't come after me when I left angry. I thought you needed space. How was I to know you'd be foolish enough to nearly die? Clara's voice hardened. Is that what you wanted, Richard? For me to die? Don't be ridiculous. You took out a life insurance policy on me. $50,000. Richard went very still. Who told you that? It's public record. Filed at the bank. Clara took a step closer. If I died in that storm, you'd have had enough money to pay off all your debts. Convenient, isn't it? You're being hysterical. But there was panic in his eyes now. The insurance was a standard precaution. Men insure their wives. I'm not your wife yet. And I'm not the first woman you've insured, am I? Clara pulled the telegram from her pocket. Catherine Brennan. She fell from a balcony last year. You collected $20,000. Richard's face went white, then red. That was an accident. A terrible tragedy. That happened while you were courting her. While you were about to marry her. Clara's voice rang out clear in the cold morning air. Just like you were courting me. Just like you were about to marry me. Until I had the bad luck to survive. You don't know what you're talking about. Richard grabbed her arm, his grip bruising. You're confused, traumatized. Pike did something to you, made you paranoid. Jonah Pike saved my life. You tried to end it. Richard's mask finally shattered. His face twisted with rage and something darker, desperation. Do you have any idea how much money I owe? How many people are waiting for me to pay? I needed that insurance money, Clara. I needed it, and you were supposed to die in that storm. From behind the hedge, Sheriff Macklin stepped out. Richard Thornton, I'm placing you under arrest. Richard spun, seeing the sheriff, seeing Tom Brennan emerging from the other side. His hand was still on Clara's arm, and now he yanked her against him, his other hand going to his coat pocket. Don't come any closer, he said, pulling out a small pistol. I'll shoot her. I swear I will. Clara felt the cold barrel of the gun press against her ribs. Her heart was pounding, but she kept her voice steady. Richard, this won't help. They heard everything. You confessed because you tricked me. His voice was rising, panic making it shrill. You manipulative little, they'll never convict me. My family has money, connections. But you're ruined now, Clara. Everyone will know you accused an innocent man. Everyone will know you're damaged goods. I don't care what they know, Clara said quietly, as long as the truth comes out. The truth? Richard laughed, a wild sound. The truth is that you were supposed to be dead. The truth is that Mountain Man ruined everything by playing hero. The truth is that I've been planning this for months, and it should have worked. Let her go, Richard. Sheriff Macklin had his gun drawn. It's over. It's not over until I say it's over. Richard pressed the gun harder against Clara's side. I'll kill her right now. I'll do it, and then you'll have to shoot me, and then everyone dies. Is that what you want? Clara caught the sheriff's eye. She saw him glance toward the gazebo, where Samuel was moving quietly through the shadows. She understood. She needed to keep Richard talking, distracted. Why Catherine? She asked. What did she do to deserve what you did to her? Richard's grip loosened slightly, his attention shifting back to Clara. Catherine was boring, dull as dishwater but rich. She would have given me the money eventually, but I couldn't wait. The debts were coming due. So I suggested the party, got her drunk, and waited until she was near the balcony. One little push, that's all it took. Everyone thought she stumbled. And me? Were you going to push me too? I was going to help you mount your horse, slap its rump, send it running into the storm. You'd fall eventually, freeze to death. Another tragic accident. Your grief-stricken fiancé would collect the insurance and console your family. He laughed bitterly. It would have worked if that damned mountain man hadn't found you. Richard Thornton, Sheriff Macklin said formally. You're under arrest for the murder of Catherine Brennan and the attempted murder of Clara Whitfield. Richard's hand was shaking now, the gun wavering. You can't prove any of this. We just did, Samuel said, stepping out from the gazebo. He held up a small mechanical device. This is a phonograph recorder, one of the new models from back east. It's been recording this entire conversation. Richard's face went slack with shock. In that moment of distraction, Clara drove her elbow hard into his stomach. He gasped, loosening his grip, and she tore away. Tom Brennan rushed forward, tackling Richard to the ground. The gun skittered across the frozen grass. It was over in seconds. Richard lay face down, Tom's knee in his back, hands being bound behind him. He was screaming obscenities, threatening lawsuits, promising revenge. But his voice was the voice of a man who knew he was finished. Clara stood shaking, Margaret rushing to her side. Sheriff Macklin retrieved the gun, checked it was safe, and then looked at Clara with something like respect in his eyes. That was brave, Miss Whitfield. Foolish, but brave. I had to save him, Clara said. Jonah Pike, I had to save him. As they led Richard away, still screaming threats, Clara felt something break loose in her chest. Relief, exhaustion, and a strange sense of lightness. She'd faced down a killer and survived. She'd found the truth and brought it to light. Now she just had to make sure that truth was enough to free an innocent man. The town hall was packed on the morning of Jonah Pike's hearing. Word had spread about Richard Thornton's arrest, about the telegram from Denver, about the recorded confession. Half the town wanted to see justice done for an innocent man. The other half wanted to see if Clara Whitfield would really testify against her former fiancé. Clara sat in the front row, her back straight, her hands folded in her lap. Margaret sat beside her and old Samuel behind them. They'd spent the previous 3 days preparing, gathering documents, organizing testimony, meeting with the circuit judge who'd arrived from Helena 2 days early to review the evidence. Judge Harrison was a lean man in his 60s with silver hair and eyes that missed nothing. He'd reviewed Richard's confession on the phonograph recording 3 times, examined the bank records Samuel had provided, and read the telegram about Catherine Brennan's death. His expression had grown grimmer with each piece of evidence. Now he sat at the bench in the town hall, converted temporarily into a courtroom, and called the hearing to order. We're here today to address charges against Jonah Pike, kidnapping and assault of Miss Clara Whitfield. However, new evidence has come to light that requires examination. He looked at Sheriff Macklin. "Sheriff, bring in the accused." Tom Brennan led Jonah into the room. He was clean-shaven, wearing clothes Samuel had provided, a simple shirt and trousers, but clean and respectable. His wrists were no longer shackled, though Tom stayed close. When Jonah's eyes found Clara's, she saw recognition there and something else. Gratitude, perhaps. Or just quiet acknowledgement. "Mr. Pike, you stand accused of serious crimes," Judge Harrison said. "But before we proceed with your case, we need to address the matter of Richard Thornton, who is now himself accused of crimes related to this incident. Miss Whitfield, you may approach." Clara stood and walked to the witness stand, her heart pounding but her voice steady. She'd practiced this, had gone over it a dozen times with Samuel. Now was the moment that mattered. She told the whole story, the argument with Richard, the debts she'd discovered, her decision to flee into the storm, her fall, the terrible cold, and then waking in Jonah's cabin, her confusion and fear, her false accusation, and then her memories returning, the investigation into Richard's past, and finally the confrontation that had led to his confession. The crowd murmured and shifted throughout her testimony. Clara could feel their judgment, their shock, their gradual shift from condemning her to sympathizing with her. When she finished, Judge Harrison studied her for a long moment. "Miss Whitfield, you accused Mr. Pike of terrible crimes. You realize your initial testimony nearly sent an innocent man to his death." "I do, Your Honor, and I will regret it for the rest of my life." Clara's voice wavered but held. "I was confused, frightened, and I let fear override reason. But once I remembered the truth, I did everything I could to make it right. Why should this court believe your memories now when you've changed your story multiple times?" "Because the evidence supports it, Your Honor. The bank records, the telegram about Catherine Brennan, and most importantly, Richard's own confession, recorded on Mr. Samuel's phonograph device." Clara met the judge's eyes. "I'm not asking you to take my word alone. I'm asking you to look at all the evidence and see the truth." Judge Harrison nodded slowly. "Sheriff, play the recording." The phonograph was set up, and Samuel carefully positioned the cylinder. The room fell silent as Richard's voice filled the air, tinny and distant but unmistakable. "I needed that insurance money, Clara. I needed it, and you were supposed to die in that storm." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The recording continued, Richard's confession spilling out in his own words, Catherine Brennan's death, the planned accident with Clara's horse, his desperate financial situation. When it ended, the silence was absolute. "Bring in Richard Thornton," Judge Harrison ordered. Richard was led in, shackled and disheveled. He'd been held in a back room, separated from the main proceedings. When he saw the crowd, when he understood that they'd all heard his confession, his face went white. "That recording was obtained illegally," he shouted. "I was tricked. You can't use it." "The recording was made in a semi-public space with witnesses present," Judge Harrison said coldly. "And more importantly, Mr. Thornton, you're not on trial today. Mr. Pike is. Your trial will come later. But your confession is relevant to whether Mr. Pike committed any crimes against Miss Whitfield." He turned to Jonah. "Mr. Pike, you've heard all this evidence. Do you have anything to say?" Jonah stood, and the room seemed to lean forward to hear him. He'd been silent throughout the proceedings, letting others speak for him. Now his voice, when it came, was calm and measured. "I found Miss Whitfield half dead in the snow. I brought her to my cabin because leaving her there meant certain death. I tended her with respect and kept her alive through the night. That's all I did." He paused. "I understand why she was afraid when she woke. A woman alone with a stranger, anyone would be frightened. I don't hold that against her. You knew you'd be suspected," Judge Harrison said. "Why take the risk?" "Because it was the right thing to do." Jonah's answer was simple, direct. "I couldn't leave her to die, no matter what it cost me." The judge studied him for a long moment. "Sheriff Macklin, in your investigation, did you find any evidence that Mr. Pike harmed Miss Whitfield?" "No, Your Honor. The doctor's examination showed injuries consistent with a fall and exposure." "Nothing else? And Miss Whitfield's initial confusion, you attribute that to trauma and hypothermia?" "Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Morrison confirmed that severe cold can cause disorientation and memory problems. Combined with her fear of Mr. Thornton, it's understandable she was confused about who the real threat was." Judge Harrison nodded slowly. Then he straightened in his chair, his voice ringing out clear and formal. "Based on the evidence presented, this court finds no credible proof that Jonah Pike committed any crime against Clara Whitfield. The charges of kidnapping and assault are hereby dismissed." He banged his gavel. "Mr. Pike, you're free to go." The room erupted. Some people cheered. Others sat in stunned silence. Clara felt tears streaming down her face as she watched Tom Brennan remove Jonah's restraints. Margaret gripped her hand, and Samuel's weathered face broke into a rare smile, but the judge wasn't finished. "Richard Thornton, you are hereby charged with the murder of Catherine Brennan of Denver, the attempted murder of Clara Whitfield, fraud, and conspiracy. You will be held without bail until your trial, which I will personally oversee in 2 weeks' time." He looked at Thornton with undisguised contempt. "If you're found guilty, and I believe you will be, you'll hang for what you've done." Richard lunged toward Clara, screaming obscenities, but the deputies held him back. As they dragged him from the room, his voice echoed off the walls. "You'll regret this, Clara. You and that mountain man, you'll both regret this." Then he was gone, and the room slowly emptied, people filing out in small groups, whispering and shaking their heads. Clara stood, her legs shaking. She wanted to go to Jonah, to apologize properly, to thank him. But her father appeared at her elbow, his face grave. "Clara, we need to talk." Judge Whitfield had been silent throughout the proceedings, sitting in the back row with his wife. Now he looked at his daughter with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. Disappointment, perhaps, mixed with something else. Understanding, maybe. Or shame. "I loaned Richard Thornton $50,000, he said quietly. "I pushed you toward that marriage because I thought it was a good match. Because his family had status and I wanted—" He stopped, shook his head. "I nearly got you killed because I was more concerned with appearances than with your happiness." Clara felt something tight in her chest loosen. "Papa, no, let me finish." He took her hands. "You were braver than I was. You faced down a killer to save an innocent man. You risked your reputation, your safety, everything, because it was right." His voice cracked. "I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry I wasn't the father you deserved." Clara embraced him, feeling his arms come around her. When they separated, she saw her mother waiting nearby, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Go," her father said. "Talk to Mr. Pike, thank him properly. He saved your life, and the least we can do is acknowledge that." Jonah was standing near the door with old Samuel, looking uncomfortable with the attention he was receiving from well-wishers. When he saw Clara approaching, he straightened, and something in his expression softened. "Mr. Pike," Clara said, then stopped, unsure how to say everything she needed to say. "I'm so sorry." "For everything." "You survived," Jonah interrupted gently. "That's what matters. You lost days of your life. Sat in a cell. Faced execution. Because of me. Because of fear and confusion. Not because of you." He studied her face. "You did right in the end, Miss Whitfield. You found the truth and fought for it. That takes courage." "I'm leaving Ashford Creek," Clara said suddenly. The decision had been forming in her mind for days, but now it crystallized into certainty. "My aunt has a school in Oregon. She's been asking me to come teach there. I think I need a fresh start." Jonah nodded. Sometimes that's the best thing. New place, new purpose. Will you go back to your mountain? It's where I belong. They stood there in the emptying hall, two people whose lives had collided by chance and been forever altered. Clara wanted to say more, to somehow express the debt she owed him. But words felt inadequate. If you're ever down this way again, she finally said, if you ever need anything, I'll remember, Jonah promised. Outside, the winter sun was bright on fresh snow. Jonah collected his few possessions from the jail, shook hands with Tom Brennan, and received a package of supplies from Samuel. Payment for your trouble, the old man said gruffly, as he prepared to head back to his cabin. Clara watched from her family's front porch. She saw him pause at the edge of town, looking back at the valley one last time. Then he turned and began the long walk up into the mountains, a solitary figure against the white landscape. Margaret came to stand beside her. Do you think he'll be all right? I think he was always all right, Clara said. He knows who he is and what he believes in. That's more than most people ever figure out. And you? Will you be all right? Clara smiled, feeling the truth of it. I will be. For the first time in a long time, I think I actually will be. 2 weeks later, Richard Thornton's trial began in the same town hall. But the atmosphere was entirely different. The room was even more crowded this time, packed with people from Ashford Creek and surrounding towns. Word had spread about the mountain man's exoneration and the wealthy man's fall from grace. People came to witness justice, or perhaps just to see a spectacle. Judge Harrison presided again, his demeanor stern and uncompromising. The prosecution, led by a territorial attorney who'd come in from Helena, presented their case methodically. They called witness after witness, building a damning portrait of Richard Thornton. Clara testified first, recounting the argument, the debts, Richard's threats. She spoke clearly, without emotion, letting the facts speak for themselves. Under cross-examination, Richard's lawyer tried to paint her as vindictive, as a woman scorned, seeking revenge. But the bank records, the insurance policies, and the telegram about Catherine Brennan made such arguments hollow. Old Samuel testified about the investigation he'd conducted. The lawyer from Denver came in person to testify about Catherine Brennan's death, bringing statements from witnesses who'd been at the party. They described Richard's attentiveness to Catherine that evening, how he'd kept refilling her glass, how he'd been standing near her just before she fell. Coincidence, Richard's lawyer argued. Tragic coincidence, but nothing more. Then the prosecutor played the phonograph recording. Richard's voice filled the courtroom once more, his confession stark and damning. I was going to help you mount your horse. Slap its rump, send it running into the storm. You'd fall eventually, freeze to death. Another tragic accident. And then, most damning of all, Catherine was boring, dull as dishwater but rich. She would have given me the money eventually, but I couldn't wait. The debts were coming due, so I suggested the party, got her drunk and waited until she was near the balcony. One little push, that's all it took. The courtroom was absolutely silent when the recording ended. Richard's lawyer stood, his face pale. Your Honor, my client was under duress when that recording was made. He was being threatened. He was being questioned by his fiancée in her family's garden, Judge Harrison interrupted. The only threat was to his criminal enterprise. He looked at Richard with cold eyes. Mr. Thornton, do you wish to testify in your own defense? Richard had been slumped in his chair, but now he straightened. Something in his expression had changed. The desperation was gone, replaced by a kind of bitter defiance. What's the point? He said. You've all made up your minds. The mountain man was innocent, so I must be guilty. The poor, confused woman remembered the truth, so I must be lying. You want a villain, and I'm convenient? We want the truth, Judge Harrison said. The truth. Richard laughed, harsh and brittle. The truth is that I played the game everyone else plays. I courted wealthy women, made advantageous matches. The only difference is that I was willing to do what others only fantasize about. He looked directly at Clara. You would have married me if you hadn't found those papers. You would have lived your comfortable life, spent your father's money, and never questioned where it came from or what I did to get it. I would have divorced you the moment I learned the truth, Clara said quietly. Maybe. Or maybe you'd have looked the other way, like so many wives do, like Catherine's family did, until I made the mistake of being too obvious. Richard's voice rose. I'm not a monster. I'm just a man who saw opportunities and took them. Catherine was going to die anyway. She had a weak heart. I just hurried things along. And Clara, he looked at her with something like genuine confusion. You were supposed to die in that storm. It would have been painless, quick. You wouldn't have suffered. You left me to freeze to death, Clara said, her voice steady despite the horror of his words. You knew I was out there and you did nothing because I needed the insurance money. Richard's composure finally cracked. Do you understand? I was drowning in debt. Every day, more threats, more demands. The mine was worthless. My father had cut me off, and your father's loan was coming due. I had no choice. You had a choice. Jonah's voice came from the back of the room. Everyone turned. Jonah stood near the door, wearing his mountain clothes, looking out of place among the town's finery. But his presence commanded attention. You could have asked for help, Jonah continued, walking slowly down the aisle. You could have declared bankruptcy. You could have been honest about your situation. Instead, you chose murder twice. He stopped in front of Richard's table. That's not desperation. That's evil. Richard stared at him, and for a moment genuine fear flickered across his face. You should have left her there. If you'd just left her there, none of this would have happened. If I'd left her there, I wouldn't be able to live with myself, Jonah said quietly. But you were willing to live with murder. That's the difference between us. Judge Harrison banged his gavel. Mr. Thornton, you've confessed to 2 murders and attempted murder. Do you have anything else to say before I render judgment? Richard sank back into his chair. Hang me then. Get it over with. Judge Harrison's verdict was swift and final. Richard Thornton, this court finds you guilty of the murder of Catherine Brennan, the attempted murder of Clara Whitfield, conspiracy to commit fraud, and multiple counts of criminal deception. His voice rang through the silent hall. These are capital crimes, committed with premeditation and malice. You have shown no remorse, only regret that you were caught. Richard stared straight ahead, his face expressionless. Therefore, it is the judgment of this court that you shall be hanged by the neck until dead, sentenced to be carried out at dawn 3 days hence. The gavel came down with a sound like a gunshot. May God have mercy on your soul. The room erupted. Some people shouted in approval. Others sat in shocked silence, even though the verdict had been inevitable. Clara felt Margaret's hand grip hers, steadying her. As the deputies moved to take Richard away, he suddenly lunged toward Clara, breaking free for just a moment. "This is your fault!" he screamed. "You ruined everything. I hope you rot in." Strong hands pulled him back. Tom Brennan and 2 other deputies wrestled him toward the door as he continued screaming threats and obscenities. Then he was gone, and the crowd began to disperse, their voices a low murmur of judgment and gossip. Clara sat very still, feeling the weight of everything settle over her. A man was going to die because of what she'd uncovered. Yes, he was a murderer. Yes, he'd tried to kill her. But still, the finality of it was overwhelming. Jonah appeared beside her, silent as always. He didn't say anything, just stood there, a steady presence. "I knew this would happen," Clara said quietly. "I knew he'd hang." But knowing it and seeing it, different things, Jonah agreed. He sat down in the chair beside her, the room emptying around them. "You did what was right. What happens to him now is justice, not revenge. I keep thinking about Catherine Brennan, about how she trusted him, about how she never knew." "She knows now," Jonah said. "Wherever she is, she knows the truth came out. That he didn't get away with it." Clara looked at him, this quiet man who'd saved her life and asked nothing in return. "How do you do it? Stay so calm, so steady, when the world is so—" She gestured helplessly. "Practice," Jonah said with a slight smile. 15 years of practice. When you live alone with your thoughts long enough, you learn to make peace with what you can't control. "I'm leaving tomorrow," Clara said. "Taking the stage to Oregon. My aunt's expecting me." "Good. Fresh start. Will you—" She stopped, unsure how to phrase the question. "Will you ever leave the mountains? Find somewhere new?" Jonah considered this. Maybe someday, but not yet. The mountains are where I belong for now, where I can think clearly, live honestly. Maybe that'll change, but I don't force it. Clara nodded, understanding. Thank you for everything. For saving my life, for forgiving my accusation, for being decent when the world wasn't. You don't owe me thanks. You did the hard part. You found the courage to face the truth and fight for it. Jonah stood. That's harder than what I did. He offered his hand, and Clara took it. His grip was firm, calloused, honest. If you're ever in Oregon, she said, there's a school in Portland. Willamette Academy? You'd be welcome. I'll remember. They walked out of the town hall together into the bright afternoon. The street was full of people talking, processing what they'd witnessed. Judge Whitfield was standing near the carriage with Clara's mother and sisters, waiting. Jonah tipped his hat to them, then turned to walk away. Mr. Pike, Judge Whitfield called out. Jonah stopped. The judge approached, his expression serious. I owe you an apology. I nearly pushed my daughter into a marriage that would have killed her. And when you saved her life, I was quick to believe you'd harmed her. That was wrong of me. You were protecting your daughter, Jonah said simply. Can't fault a father for that. Still, I'm grateful. And if there's anything you need, supplies, money, assistance of any kind, I'm all right, Jonah said. But I appreciate the offer. He shook the judge's hand, nodded to the women, and then he was walking away, heading toward the edge of town where the mountain trail began. Clara watched him go. This solitary figure who'd briefly intersected with her life and changed everything. She wondered if she'd ever see him again, or if he'd simply fade back into the mountains and become a story people told. The mountain man who saved the Maiden from the storm. Margaret touched her arm. Ready to go home? Yes, Clara said. But as she climbed into the carriage, she took one last look back. Jonah was already a small figure in the distance, heading up the slope toward the snow-covered peaks. 3 days later, at dawn, Richard Thornton was hanged in the yard behind the town hall. Clara was already gone by then, on a stage heading west toward Oregon and her new life. She didn't watch him die. She didn't need to. The truth had been told. Justice had been done, and somewhere in the mountains above Ashford Creek, Jonah Pike was checking his trapline, tending his fire, living the life he'd chosen. 2 lives saved. 1 life ended, and the snow kept falling, covering everything in white, waiting for spring to reveal what lay beneath. 6 months later, spring had come to the Bitterroot Mountains. Jonah stood outside his cabin in the morning light, watching the creek run high with snowmelt. The ice had broken weeks ago, and now the water rushed and tumbled over rocks, alive with the sound of renewal. The pines had shed their heavy load of snow, standing tall and green against a blue sky. Bears were emerging from their dens. Birds were returning from wherever they'd spent the winter. Everything was waking up. Jonah had spent the winter much as he always did, tending his trapline, reading his books, writing in his journal. But something had changed in him. He'd been forced back into the world of people, had been judged and vindicated, had seen both the worst and the best of human nature in the span of a few weeks. He'd expected to feel relief when he returned to his solitude. Instead, he felt, not lonely exactly, but aware of what he'd been missing. On his table lay a letter, the envelope worn from traveling. It had arrived 2 days ago, brought up by old Samuel, who'd made the trek to deliver it personally. Jonah had read it 3 times already, but he opened it again now, unfolding the careful script. Dear Mr. Pike, I hope this letter finds you well and that your mountains are treating you kindly. I wanted to write and let you know that I've settled in Portland. My aunt's school is wonderful, full of children who are eager to learn and teachers who genuinely care about their students. I've been given my own classroom, teaching literature and history to students aged 12 to 16. It's been an adjustment. After everything that happened, I wasn't sure I'd ever feel safe or whole again. But teaching has given me purpose, and the distance from Ashford Creek has given me perspective. I think about that night often, not with fear anymore, but with gratitude. You saved my life, Mr. Pike, not just from the cold, but from a future that would have destroyed me. Because of you, I'm free to build a life on my own terms. I heard from Margaret that Richard's execution went forward as scheduled. I won't pretend to mourn him, but I do hope he found some measure of peace before the end. I hope Catherine Brennan's family found some measure of closure. My father wrote to say he's paying off Richard's debts from his own pocket as a way of making amends for his part in what happened. Mother has been visiting Catherine's family in Denver, offering what comfort she can. My family is healing in their own way. I wanted to tell you all of this because you were part of my story, and I thought you deserved to know how it turned out. But I also wanted to say something else, something I didn't have the chance to say properly when I left. You showed me what integrity looks like, what it means to do the right thing, even when it costs you everything. You could have walked past me that day. You could have left me to die and avoided all the trouble that followed. But you didn't, because that's not who you are. I'm trying to be that kind of person too. The kind who does what's right even when it's hard. You taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the choice to act despite it. Thank you for that lesson. Thank you for everything. If you ever find yourself in Portland, please look me up. Willamette Academy? I'd be honored to show you around and introduce you to people who might appreciate your wisdom. Until then, be well. May your mountains keep you safe and your solitude bring you peace. With deepest gratitude and respect, Clara Whitfield Jonah folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. Then he walked to his journal and opened it to a fresh page. He'd been making entries all winter, weather observations, animal sightings, the usual record of his days. But now he wrote something different. Sometimes a man spends years running from pain, thinking solitude is the same as healing. He builds walls around his heart and calls it wisdom. He mistakes isolation for peace, but then something happens. A storm, a choice, a chance encounter, and those walls crack. You remember what it feels like to be part of the world, to matter to someone, to make a difference. I saved Clara Whitfield's life, and in doing so she saved something in me. She reminded me that there's still good in the world, that courage and truth matter, that one person's choices can ripple out and change everything. I don't know what comes next. Maybe I'll stay in these mountains another 15 years. Maybe I'll venture down more often, remember how to be among people. Maybe I'll even make that trip to Oregon one day, see what Clara has built with her second chance. But for now, I'm content. The winter is over, spring is here, and I'm alive to see it. That's enough. He set down his pen and looked out the window at the sunlit peaks. On impulse, he reached for his pack and began filling it with supplies. A walk, he decided. A long one, down to the trading post. Maybe he'd stay in town for a few days, have some real conversations. Remember what it felt like to be part of a community. Before he left, he picked up a piece of wood he'd been carving, a small bird, wings spread in flight. He'd worked on it through the long winter nights, letting his hands shape something beautiful out of rough timber. It was finished now, smooth and delicate, ready to fly. He wrapped it carefully and tucked it in his pack. He'd give it to Samuel, ask him to send it to Clara. She'd understand what it meant. Freedom, hope, new beginnings. Jonah shouldered his pack and stepped out into the spring morning. The trail down the mountain was clear now, easy walking. He set off at a steady pace, the sun warm on his face, the sound of the creek accompanying him. Behind him, the cabin stood solid and waiting, knowing he'd return. But for now, he was walking toward the world instead of away from it. And that felt right. The mountains would always be there, offering solitude when he needed it. But maybe, Jonah thought, he didn't need it quite as much as he used to. Maybe there was room in his life for both. The peace of solitude and the warmth of connection. Maybe that was the real wisdom he'd been searching for all these years. The trail curved down through the pines, and Jonah followed it one step at a time, toward whatever came next. Above him, an eagle circled on the morning thermals, riding the wind with effortless grace. Jonah watched it for a moment, marveling at its freedom, its perfect balance between earth and sky. Then he smiled, adjusted his pack and continued walking. Spring had come to the mountains, and with it the possibility of something new,